On one of my many trips to the local record town in the 90s, I discovered what I thought was going to be the next great sword and sorcery anime that would satisfy my hunger for more of the genre after watching the all-time classic that is Record of Lodoss War. I was looking through the selection trying to find something within the fantasy setting that would have something on the box art or the description to indicate it played the genre straight and took itself seriously. It was there that I found it, the anime that would fulfill my desires. One that would be the next great fantasy epic and tell a story of faith and bravery, overcoming the forces of darkness. One that would... yeah, okay, it was Fire Emblem. You clicked the video, you know what it was, and you saw the intro. And it wasn't the next great fantasy epic telling sprawling tales of heroics, but goddammit, it could have been. And I've always hated that it wasn't. I'll go out on a limb and say that potential viewers of this video might also be fans of JRPGs. If you're one of those people, and you're probably familiar with the Fire Emblem series. However, if you're of a younger generation, what you might not know is that the first form of Fire Emblem media released outside of Japan wasn't any of the games, it was this OVA. So when I skipped home from the mall that day, I had no idea what I had purchased was an anime based on a video game, namely the third game in the series. All I knew was that it looked like this, and this looked awesome. One young hero, a legendary sword. Yep, say no more, I'm in. I ripped off the plastic, discovered that it was even cooler than I assumed because within the box rested this fresh looking white VHS tape. I popped it into the VCR, 60 minutes later, I was sold. I'd hit the jackpot. The character designs and art direction in general are not overly loud or vibrant like you'd find in some of the quirkier takes of fantasy like Slayers. The closest to that you'd get is the hair color of the various characters we meet in the story, but it is an anime, so that kind of thing is to be expected. Each of the episodes contains a brief narration after a cold open, in which we're provided with a little world building.
セントアカネイアを中心とする7つの大国がひしめくこの地に戦乱と狂気の神が降臨した。暗黒竜メディウス率いるドルーア国がカダインの司祭ガーネフと結託しアカネイアに攻撃を開始したのである。ドルーアの力にアカネイアパレスは壊滅。英雄アンリの血と意志を受け継ぐアリティア国もまた帝国軍の前にひざまずいた。大陸は暗黒が支配する時代へ移り変わる。時にアカネイア歴602年、今から2年前のことである。
Our protagonist is Prince Mars of Eretia. Yes, I know it's actually Marth, we'll get to that later. And he's given a decent amount of personality and character development within just 15 minutes of the first episode. Nothing all that unique or interesting, but acceptable in terms of fantasy. While I still prefer following a hero with a story like Parn from Record of Lodoss War, a young man of no particular importance that's too brave for his own good, Mars is likable enough for someone born of status. Through flashbacks we see that, as a child, he displayed compassion more often than toughness, and often worried that he would never be strong enough in the eyes of his father, or strong enough to protect his kingdom. Through similar flashbacks, we also learn that his country is betrayed on the battlefield by their supposed ally. Instead of flanking the forces of Doria as planned, they turn their swords on the Oretian knights. Eretia is routed, leaving only Mars' father and a small band of his knights alive to discover the aftermath. Mars' father makes the fateful decision to confront the villainous Garnath, believing his sword capable of defeating the dark powers that threatened the continent. He was wrong. The first episode opens with a scene that I presume takes place shortly after the king's death, in which Mars, Jagan, at least I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, a commander of the Oretian Knights, and Mars' older sister, Elise, are on the run as enemy forces close in on them. When they're cornered, Mars and Jagan prepare to make a last stand. However, Elise uses magic to transport the two to safety, sacrificing herself.
生きるのです、マルス。
The bulk of the story takes place 2 years later, where we find that Mars and a small group of Aretian knights have been taking refuge within the borders of their ally, the country of Talis. Mars has befriended the princess of Talis, at least I think she's a princess. In the game, is she a princess? In this she is, I don't know. Anyway, her name is Sheeta. Sheeta's developed feelings for Mars that he's at least acutely aware of, at least enough aware of them that he subjects himself to a day of fun, including a shopping montage. While initially agreeing to stay at the palace for dinner, Mars changes his mind when he overhears discussions about the danger Talis is in by continuing to provide sanctuary for Mars and his Aretian knights, conjuring feelings of shame at the position he's in and at the burden he's placing on the people of Talis by being there. Soon enough, Mars's hand will be forced when Talis is suddenly attacked by the same forces that had invaded and occupied his homeland. He decides that he can't sit back while the country that's protected him falls under attack. He knows that helping them will expose their location to the forces of Duria, but he also refuses to hide any longer. Mars and his knights ride into battle. We're treated with some decent action as Mars saves the city, and Sheeta, who found herself in distress while attempting to protect her father. The second episode of the OVA moves the plot along a little further. Mars knows that with his location exposed, it's time that they take the fight to the enemy and free his people. However, in true JRPG fashion, they're also tasked with the side quest of rescuing a priestess named Lena. This episode also focuses a lot of its attention on a character named Nabaru. At least, again, I think that's how it's pronounced. I don't know how to pronounce it. I'll be honest, I'm sorry. There's too many conflicting things between the game and the OVA. Anyway, he doesn't do anything without demonstrating how cool he is. So, that's a plus. And another character named Julian, who sneaks Lena food while she's held captive and later attempts to help her escape, although unsuccessfully. The second episode also follows our heroes as they raid a mercenary camp to rescue Lena. They complete this task, gain a few new allies, and we're left with another admittedly awkward freeze-frame style ending promising that the adventure will continue. Only, it wouldn't, at least not in the form of this OVA. That's because the second episode would be the last one that was produced. I don't remember how long it took for me to figure this out back in the day. I recall checking the anime VHS section for a while, waiting for a second tape to magically appear there, but that day never came. Eventually I moved on and Fire Emblem faded into memory. Years later I would come across Fire Emblem for the Game Boy Advance. While this was actually the 7th game in the Fire Emblem series subtitled The Blazing Blade, it was simply branded as Fire Emblem in the West as it was the first game to be released here back in 2004. It was then that I finally realized Fire Emblem was a much bigger franchise than just some old anime I had watched on a VCR. I bought the game and played a little bit, but I never finished it. I was never big on handheld consoles, and I was in my college years at the time, so I found myself playing things like Counter-Strike far more than RPGs. That is, when I wasn't trying to be social or trying to win at beer pong and failing miserably. So to this day I still haven't been exposed to the whole story of any of the Fire Emblem games, but that isn't the topic at hand here. Watching the OVA again after all these years was an interesting experience. I wouldn't say that I had any nostalgia for it, as it was something I remembered enjoying but never really watched it a second time after I had realized it was a cancelled series, but I can certainly say that I remember what I liked about it. It was a straightforward fantasy world setting. There was some humor and colorful characters, but nothing overly wacky or silly. It took itself seriously for the most part, much like Record of Lodoss War did. The character design was on par with all other anime that I enjoyed at the time, and the art direction was nice in general. The use of color was tactful, and added a level of realism to the environments. I particularly enjoyed the scene from the opening and the flashbacks to the battlefield and how the muted color and lighting gave off a foreboding feeling with each scene. While there's certainly nothing here that approaches the level of beauty and artwork that's found on the Record of Lodoss War OVA, it's by no means bad. The animation was nothing stellar either, but it doesn't come off as cheap, at least most of the time. One of the low points of the OVA for me was the soundtrack though. It's not entirely bad, but much of the music sounds like it was taken directly from the game files on the Super Famicom cartridge. and for all I know, that's exactly what happened. I got the sense that there was a significant enough budget for the OVA, although there's not a lot of concrete information I could find on that. In fact, I've seen conflicting information regarding the length of the OVA online. In some articles, it's indicated that it was cancelled due to a lack of interest or low sales, while other articles indicated it was never really intended to be a full production. Maybe it was just an adaptation of the story to promote the game series. I couldn't find any solid information one way or the other, and I'd be lying if I said I went too deep on the dive to begin with. I'm sure that information is out there if you want to look hard enough for it, or if you're able to read Japanese so you can go back to some of the articles from when it was released. Whatever the reason, it's always struck me as odd that it would be chosen for an English dubbing and a Western release, especially considering the games had no presence in the US at the time anyway. Then again, it certainly isn't the only case of an unfinished anime getting this type of localization treatment. As an outsider in terms of being a fan of the game series, I was left wanting more and disappointed that this never went anywhere. However, I also know that the OVA has a somewhat controversial reputation amongst fans of the game series. Firstly, the English dub is hilariously bad and cheesy at points. It's not something I remember noticing when I was younger, but trying to rewatch this again made it painfully clear. I was lucky enough to track down a fan sub of the OVA, courtesy of Orphan Fan Subs. As with many anime of the time, subtitled is definitely the far better choice when you want to watch something like this. Fans of the games also have other bones to pick with this anime in terms of the depiction of some of the characters, especially Shida, who saddled with a bit of the tsundere, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, stereotype in this adaptation. I imagine it's far from her personality in the games, at least that's the impression I get from the fan reactions I've read. Another interesting quirk is that because the localization of the anime predated any of the games making their way west, the pronunciations of the countries involved, the names of several of the characters, don't match their video game counterparts. In particular, the person I've been referring to as Mars for the duration of the video is actually named Marth. While I'm on this topic, for anybody that I've annoyed through this video, talking about whether I've pronounced something correctly or not, I've mostly been going with the pronunciations as depicted in the OVA because that's my only real knowledge of the Fire Emblem series. I kept getting them confused with each other while writing this and trying to remember which was the correct way to spell or say one of them, but I just gave up. So I'm sorry if that offends you. But also, if it does, one thing I also found interesting while doing a little research on this anime was a significant amount of star power behind its production. As noted in this article, the OVA was directed by Shin Basara, who's probably better known by most anime fans in America for his work on Initial D. The script was written by Yusuke Kuroda, who would go on to find great success with Trigun and My Hero Academia, just to name a few. And the character designs were done by Yuji Moriyama, creator of the famous Project Echo OVA, and also apparently the designer for the breakthrough erotic anime Cream Lemon?
Oh my.
Ultimately, if you're a fan of the Fire Emblem game series and you've never seen this, I can't say I would recommend watching the OVA other than to satisfy some morbid curiosity about it that you might have. Seeing as how it's only about an hour long to complete, it's not really a huge time investment if you want to take the dive. If you aren't familiar with Fire Emblem and are a fan of fantasy anime, I would say almost the same, unfortunately. It's a small time investment for something that I think is entertaining but ultimately unfulfilling. I don't think it's as bad as its reputation suggests, especially if you watch with the original Japanese dialogue. What I can and will give it credit for is generating interest in the game series for me personally. Granted, it generated that interest about 25 years later than it probably should have, but better late than never, I suppose. So, I've decided I'm going to finally dive into the games and get the whole Fire Emblem story, or at least attempt to. Maybe I'll see some of you out there in the fan forums in the future where I'll finally be able to understand the memes and know the full story behind that guy I used to play in Super Smash Bros. Maybe.